5 true scary stories from haunted hospitals. Ghostly encounters that will haunt you. Dr. Eric Williams stood at the entrance of a hospital, a worn-down, creaky building that seemed to echo with the weight of its history. The sign above the door, long faded, read St. Mary's Hospital, but to the locals, it was simply known as the Haunted Hospital. A newcomer to the area, Dr. Williams had heard whispers about this place long before his first shift, but he hadn't thought much of them. He'd heard the stories, ghosts, strange noises, and sightings of figures that should have never been there. But to him, these were nothing more than the exaggerated tales that tend to accompany old buildings with a past. He was a man of science, a skeptic through and through. There was no room in his mind for the supernatural. Still, as he stepped through the revolving door and into the dimly lit lobby, a shiver ran down his spine. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, as if the building itself were aware of its dark reputation and was silently daring him to uncover its secrets. Dr. Williams glanced around, taking in the dusty floors, the peeling wallpaper, and the faint smell of antiseptic and decay. The hospital had seen better days. It was clear that this was no modern, state-of-the-art facility. This was a relic of the past, a place where time seemed to stand still, its old bones creaking under the weight of the decades. He was greeted by the head nurse, a middle-aged woman named Margaret, whose face was tight with a kind of unspoken tension. "Welcome to St. Mary's, Dr. Williams," she said, her voice a little too steady, her eyes a little too distant. "I hope you're ready for a night shift. It gets a bit unsettling around here at night." Dr. Williams smiled politely, masking the small flicker of unease that tugged at his chest. He had read the pamphlets about the hospital's history. Nothing out of the ordinary, just your typical stories of high mortality rates from the early 20th century and a few accidents here and there. But none of that could explain the look on Nurse Margaret's face or the way she avoided meeting his eyes when she spoke. "The psychiatric ward is just up the stairs," she continued, her voice lowering. "It's been closed off for years now, but some of the older staff still swear they can hear things up there. As for the morgue," she paused, looking at him pointedly. "Let's just say, it's best not to be down there alone after dark." Dr. Williams chuckled softly, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm sure it's all just superstition, right?" Margaret didn't answer at first. She simply gave him a tight smile and walked away, leaving him alone in the lobby. He shook his head, deciding that he'd let the local rumors roll off him like water off a duck's back. He had a job to do, and he would do it well. The hospital's strange reputation would not distract him from his responsibilities. But as the night wore on, and the long, silent hours passed, Dr. Williams began to notice things. Small things that made him question whether he had misjudged the hospital's ghost stories. The lights flickered, casting odd shadows on the walls. The air grew colder as he made his way down the corridors, despite the heat running through the vents. Occasionally, he would catch a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, only to vanish when he looked directly at it. By midnight, he found himself standing at the entrance to the psychiatric ward, staring up at the worn door that was half hidden behind a layer of dust. He had been told it was off limits, but something about the place called to him. There was a heaviness in the air that he couldn't shake, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. "Are you going up there?" A voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Nurse Margaret standing behind him, her arms crossed. She had the same expression as before, but now there was something else in her eyes, a glimmer of something unspoken, something that made him feel like he had just stepped into the wrong story. "I was just," Dr. Williams started, but he trailed off, suddenly unsure of why he was standing here at all. "I thought I'd check it out. See if the stories are true." Margaret didn't smile this time. Instead, she shook her head slowly. "Don't go up there, Dr. Williams. You may not come back the same." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone once again. As he watched her disappear down the corridor, a sense of dread crept over him. The hospital's dark past seemed to pulse through the very air, and for the first time, Dr. Williams felt the weight of its history pressing down on him. The eerie reputation of St. Mary's wasn't just a collection of old stories. There was something more to it, something real. He swallowed hard and made his way toward the stairs. It was time to see for himself what lay behind the doors of the psychiatric ward. Little did he know, this would be the beginning of his descent into a world where the line between the living and the dead was dangerously thin. Story 1. Hauntings in Psychiatric Wards. Dr. Eric Williams stood at the threshold of the psychiatric ward, hesitating as the musty smell of old furniture and decaying walls reached his nostrils. The dim lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to crawl across the floor. This section of the hospital was the oldest, tucked away at the farthest end, untouched by renovations or modern equipment. To the outside world, it was a forgotten place, a remnant of a time when mental health care was primitive and brutal. "You sure you're ready for this?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Nurse Alana, a veteran of the ward, her tired eyes shadowed by years of long shifts and unsettling experiences. She had been the one to show him around the hospital, guiding him through the labyrinth of hallways and operating rooms. But when it came to the psychiatric ward, her demeanor had changed. There was a wariness in her gaze, a cautionary tone in her voice. "I've heard the rumors," Dr. Williams replied with a half smile, trying to mask his discomfort. "Old wards, old stories. Probably just a bit of folklore." Alana's lips tightened into a thin line. "It's not just stories," she said softly, glancing around as if expecting someone or something to be listening. "The ward has a history, a dark history. In the 60s, they conducted some of the worst experiments on patients here. They didn't care about ethics or consent. It was all about testing boundaries, pushing the mind to its limits. Some patients, they didn't make it out." Dr. Williams frowned, the skepticism in his mind at odds with the unease growing in his stomach. "What kind of experiments?" "They tried everything," Alana continued. "Shock therapy, drug trials, even sensory deprivation. The kind of things that would break anyone. The ward was notorious for it, and a lot of the patients died in here under strange circumstances. Their deaths were never fully explained. Some say they were just discarded, but the spirits, they never left." She fell silent, her gaze flickering to the dark corridor behind him. Dr. Williams, unwilling to show how unnerved he felt, tried to lighten the mood. "Sounds like a bit of a ghost story to me." "Maybe," Alana muttered, stepping closer to him. "But it's not just stories. Some of us, the staff, we've seen things. Shadows moving in the corners of our eyes. Figures standing in the windows at night when no one should be there. And the whispers, they get louder the longer you're here." The air in the hallway seemed to press in on him as Dr. Williams absorbed her words. "Okay, well, I'll take it all with a grain of salt." But as he made his way deeper into the ward that night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The walls were stained yellow with age. The floors creaked underfoot as if they carried the weight of something unseen. Every room he passed seemed to harbor a secret, the curtains drawn tight, the doors closed, as if trying to keep whatever was inside hidden. It was past midnight when the shift grew quieter. The ward had emptied out, leaving him alone. Dr. Williams had expected this. He knew that late-night shifts often left staff stretched thin. But there was something about this place, something about the silence that was unnerving. The isolation felt heavier here than it ever had before. Suddenly, a low sound broke the stillness. A whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Dr. Williams froze, straining his ears. It came again, a voice he couldn't quite understand, murmuring from the far end of the corridor. He turned to face the source, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. His heart raced as he walked down the hall, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The whispering continued, now mingling with faint, rustling sounds, like something brushing against the walls. He found himself outside room 6, one of the rooms that had once housed the most disturbed patients. He didn't know why, but something pulled him inside. As he stepped into the room, the temperature seemed to drop sharply. His breath came out in visible clouds as he reached for the light switch. But before he could flick it on, the light bulb above him popped, plunging him into darkness. Panic started to rise in his chest, but he forced it down. It's just a faulty bulb, he thought. But then he heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone walking just behind him. He spun around, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder now, voices intertwining in a frantic, indecipherable language. Dr. Williams pressed his hand against his temple, trying to push the sound away. His heart pounded in his chest as the temperature dropped even further, causing him to shiver uncontrollably. Suddenly, a figure materialized in the doorway. A woman, her face obscured by dark hair, her clothes tattered and torn, her skin as pale as death. She stepped forward, but as Dr. Williams took a step back, the figure vanished in a flash. He stumbled backward, colliding with a chair that fell over with a loud crash. The whispers died, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing. He felt something behind him, an overwhelming presence, as though the room itself was alive, breathing with him. The door slammed shut behind him, and he spun around. The woman was back, only this time, she wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, their faces blurred, their eyes hollow. They began to move toward him, their movements slow, deliberate, as if they were drawn to him, sensing his fear. For a moment, Dr. Williams could barely move. The fear was suffocating, like a hand around his throat. But then, in a surge of adrenaline, he bolted for the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The figures didn't chase him. They stayed still, watching, their silent gaze following him as he rushed out of the room. He barely made it back to the nurse's station, his hands shaking as he gripped the counter. He had just experienced something beyond his understanding. But as he glanced around at the other staff, there was no mention of what he had just witnessed. No one seemed to have noticed anything out of the ordinary. Dr. Williams, Nurse Alana's voice broke through his thoughts. She was standing behind him, her eyes full of knowing. "You saw them, didn't you?" He turned to her, his voice trembling. What is this? What is happening here?" "They're not here to hurt you," she said softly, her expression unreadable. "They never were. They were just like you, living people who were broken by this place. They're trying to warn you. You're not alone, Doctor." Dr. Williams was confused, fear gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. "Warn me? What are they trying to say?" Alana's face darkened. "It's not the ghosts you should be afraid of. It's what's behind them. The entity. The one that manipulates minds. It's always been here, just waiting to find a weak link. And tonight, you were it." The room seemed to close in on him, and he realized with growing horror that the real terror of this place was not the restless spirits, but something far darker, something that thrived on fear and control. As he walked out of the psychiatric ward, Dr. Williams felt a cold, unseen hand settle over him, a presence that would follow him long after he left this haunted hospital. Story 2. Paranormal events in hospital staff rooms. The hospital staff lounge was far removed from the more bustling sections of the building, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the basement. It had no windows, the walls were bare, and the flickering overhead light cast long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Dr. Williams had passed the door countless times on his way to the morgue or to check on patients, but he had never paid much attention to it until recently. Lately, strange things had been happening in the hospital after hours, things he couldn't explain, and all of them seemed to point toward the staff lounge. At first, it was subtle, a soft murmur of voices, almost imperceptible, as though someone was speaking just behind him. He dismissed it as tired minds conjuring up imaginary sounds, but it became harder to ignore when several of the hospital's nurses and janitors began avoiding the lounge altogether. "Dr. Williams, you sure you want to go in there?" Nurse Susan asked him one evening, her voice filled with an odd hesitation. She was a seasoned nurse, tough as nails, but there was something in her eyes as she stared at the door to the lounge. "What's wrong with the lounge?" he asked, glancing at the door. Susan shook her head. Nothing at all. Just don't stay too long in there." When Dr. Williams pressed her for more information, she only muttered something about shadows flickering and whispers and quickly walked away. It wasn't the first time he had heard strange rumors surrounding this particular room. The staff had always spoken in hushed tones about the basement and its eerie reputation, but no one ever provided any real answers. Most of the staff just avoided the area altogether. Intrigued and increasingly unnerved by the cryptic warnings, Dr. Williams decided to spend a night observing the room. He arranged for a late shift, telling his colleagues he would be reviewing some patient files. He didn't expect anything extraordinary, but a part of him wondered what might happen if he remained awake in the staff lounge for an entire night. As he entered the basement, the temperature seemed to drop. The faint scent of stale coffee and burnt food hung in the air. He sat in one of the worn chairs and began his watch, glancing at the empty space that had once served as a haven for tired medical professionals, now feeling more like a mausoleum than a break room. Time stretched into stillness, and the quiet of the room seemed oppressive, as though the walls themselves were watching him. His eyes started to grow heavy, but just as he was about to doze off, he heard it, the sound of a soft whisper, as though someone had spoken his name. Dr. Williams blinked and sat up straighter, his heart pounding. He listened closely, but there was nothing now, just the quiet hum of the building settling. He shook his head. It's nothing, just the wind, he told himself. But then it came again, louder this time. Faint, broken whispers, like voices from the past. His pulse quickened. He stood, moving toward the source of the sound, toward the farthest corner of the room where the shadows seemed to cluster thickest. The whispers grew more distinct, fragments of words, half-formed sentences. He couldn't make them out, but the tone was unmistakable, a sense of desperation, of fear. As he neared the corner, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a shadow flickering across the wall. He froze. The shadow moved with an unnatural fluidity, shifting in and out of view like a living thing. He blinked, and for a split second, he thought he saw a figure dressed in a white hospital gown, face obscured by long, dark hair. A low moan echoed from the shadow, sending chills down his spine. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, and oppressive, as though the space itself was being suffocated by the presence of something unseen. It was then that Dr. Williams realized this wasn't a typical haunting. These weren't just echoes of the past. The spirits in this room were not merely trapped. They were reliving their final moments, over and over again. Suddenly, the shadow flickered into view fully, and Dr. Williams saw the ghostly figure of a nurse. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and she was staring directly at him. She raised her hand, fingers contorted unnaturally, reaching out toward him as if to pull him into the torment she had endured. Before he could react, the figure vanished with a soft, inaudible scream. The room went silent again, but this time, Dr. Williams knew he wasn't alone. The whispers intensified, and he saw more shapes forming in the shadows, ghostly apparitions of former staff members, each one locked in an eternal cycle of horror. He stepped back, his heart racing. The room seemed to stretch and warp around him. He could feel the weight of the past pressing in on him, dragging him into the same madness that had consumed these poor souls. The nurse, her figure now more solid, stepped toward him again. But this time, she spoke, her voice fractured and broken, barely recognizable. "It was us, we didn't mean it." Her words were interrupted by a shriek, a garbled cry of despair. It was another nurse, or perhaps another figure, but the voices were blending together, speaking over one another, trapped in their eternal cycle of torment. The words barely made sense, fragments of sentences barely audible, as if the spirits themselves didn't understand their fate. We didn't know what we were doing. Help us. End it." Dr. Williams stumbled backward, panic creeping into his mind. These weren't simple hauntings. These were souls stuck in a cycle of despair. They were reliving their final moments of torment, their suicides, their desperation, over and over again. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These people were not merely dead, they were trapped in their own hellish loop. The room, it seemed, was more than just a place of death. It was a prison for the souls of the very people who had been part of the unethical experiments that had tainted the hospital's history. And then he understood they were not haunting the room. The spirits of the past were bound to it, forced to relive their final moments endlessly. They couldn't move on. They couldn't find peace. The hospital, this institution, had condemned them to a living nightmare. Dr. Williams turned and bolted for the door, but as he reached for the handle, he was gripped by a cold, unseen hand. A voice, no longer a whisper, but a scream, erupted from behind him. "You don't understand. You can't leave. It's too late." The door slammed shut in his face with terrifying force, trapping him inside. He spun around in panic, but the figures were gone. The room was still. For a brief moment, he thought he had imagined it all, until he saw the blood-stained markings on the floor, the faded outlines of where bodies had once lain. Finally, the door creaked open, and he stumbled out into the hall, gasping for air. But the visions of the ghostly staff were burned into his mind, their tortured faces lingering like a poison he couldn't shake. As he walked back to his office, trying to regain some semblance of composure, he realized one terrifying truth. The hospital was not just haunted by the past, it was alive with it, and he was now a part of it. The haunting of the staff lounge wasn't over. It had only just begun. Story 3. The Haunting of the Morgue. The morgue was cold, colder than anything Dr. Williams had ever experienced. Even the usual hum of the ventilation system felt eerily absent, and the silence, broken only by the faintest echoes of distant footsteps, was suffocating. The walls were sterile white, too pristine to offer any comfort. It was a place where the living and the dead were bound by an unspoken understanding. The living did their work, and the dead waited. That night, the sense of waiting felt particularly heavy. Dr. Williams had been summoned to the morgue to perform an autopsy on a patient who had died under mysterious circumstances. The report had come in only a few hours before. A 39-year-old woman, found in her apartment in an apparently peaceful sleep, but her body showed signs of severe trauma. No one could explain how she had died, but as the only available physician on call, Dr. Williams was asked to perform the examination. He stood in front of the steel table where the woman's body lay, her expression serene, frozen in a final moment of peace. His mind was preoccupied with the strange circumstances of the death, but his professional demeanor kept him focused. He reached for his scalpel, but the moment his fingers brushed against the cold metal handle, something shifted in the air. The temperature in the morgue plummeted. A chill ran down his spine, and he could see his breath in the air, misting in the unnatural cold. He paused, eyes narrowing, but he quickly attributed it to a draft from the air conditioning. He made the first incision, the sound of the scalpel slicing through flesh, sending an uneasy tremor through him. But as soon as the cut was made, a strange feeling crawled up his skin, an unsettling sense that something was terribly wrong. The instruments, which had been neatly arranged on the counter just moments ago, suddenly shifted as if moved by unseen hands. The forceps on the table slid gently across the surface and dropped to the floor with a sharp clang. Dr. Williams spun around, eyes wide, heart racing. The room was empty. He was alone, or so he thought. He turned back to the body and continued his work, but as he did, something strange began to happen. A soft whisper, barely audible at first, began to drift through the air. He paused again, this time more cautiously. It wasn't the whir of the ventilation system. It wasn't the sound of distant voices from the hallway. This was something different, something closer. The whispering grew louder, though still indistinct. He held his breath, straining to listen. The voice was soft, pained, like a breathless murmur coming from somewhere deep within the morgue. Slowly, Dr. Williams turned toward the rows of steel drawers that lined the walls of the room. His skin prickled as the air seemed to shift again, becoming thicker, heavier. Then, the whispering stopped. Silence. The silence lingered for only a moment before it was broken, this time by a sharp, rasping breath. Dr. Williams whipped around, and his blood ran cold. One of the bodies on the table, the woman he had been working on, moved. Her fingers twitched, the wrist jerked, just slightly, and then, in a violent spasm, her hand curled into a fist, clenched tightly. Dr. Williams stumbled back, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He had seen his fair share of deceased bodies, but nothing like this. His mind screamed for reason, but his body was paralyzed. Was this a post-mortem reaction? A reflex? No, something more was happening here. The body on the table was not supposed to move. The room darkened, and the whispers returned, now clearer, almost frantic. They were coming from the bodies in the drawers, the ones he hadn't yet touched. With horror-stricken eyes, He watched as shadows shifted within each of the bodies. The whispers became voices, each one telling a different tale. Each body had a story to tell, stories of death that didn't make sense. Some of them spoke of suffocation, others of being buried alive. I couldn't breathe, a voice whispered from the farthest drawer. I was still awake. I could feel the dirt, the weight of it pressing down. The more Dr. Williams listened, the more he was drawn into the voices. His head throbbed with each tale of terror, each voice telling him how they had died, how they had been wrongly declared dead and left to rot in the cold earth, buried alive. He staggered backward, the walls of the morgue seeming to close in on him as the voices grew louder, more insistent. But it was the body on the table, the woman who had moved, that captured his attention. Her chest rose and fell, shallow, but unmistakable. She was breathing, and as Dr. Williams stepped closer, he saw her eyes snap open, staring straight at him. But there was no life in them, only an empty, hollow gaze. No, you're dead," Dr. Williams muttered under his breath, stepping back, fear surging through his veins. But the woman's hand suddenly shot up, gripping his wrist with unnatural strength. Her cold fingers dug into his skin, and he gasped, unable to break free. Help me, help me!" The voice came from her, but it wasn't her voice. It was something else, something deeper, darker. Dr. Williams tried to pull away, but her grip tightened, pulling him closer, forcing him to meet her lifeless eyes. "You must listen. They are all here." He felt a cold breath against his ear as the whisper came again. "They are all here. All of them." And in that moment, he realized the full, terrifying truth. The morgue was not just a place of death. It was a prison for the souls of those who had been buried alive, their lives stolen from them in the most horrific way. The hospital had been complicit in their suffering, and now their vengeful spirits had returned. The woman's grip slackened, and Dr. Williams pulled away, stumbling backward toward the door. But it was too late. As he turned to flee, he saw the shadows in the morgue move, heard the whispers grow louder. The voices were no longer individual. They were a chorus of the dead, a cacophony of sorrow and rage. And then the lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness. And with that, the whispering stopped. But Dr. Williams knew he hadn't escaped. The morgue had claimed him. The spirits, those who had been wronged by the hospital, had claimed him too. When he left the morgue, he was not the same man who had entered. He had seen the truth, and now he carried it with him, an undeniable weight. The haunting had only just begun, and he was their next target. Story 4. Eerie Hospital Bedside Stories. The room was dimly lit, its walls painted in a sterile shade of pale blue that felt as if it had been untouched by the warmth of the world outside. The hum of the machines was a constant companion to the soft, ragged breaths of the young patient lying in the bed. Dr. Williams had visited her several times over the past few days, checking on her progress, listening to her lungs, making notes on his clipboard. She was only a child, perhaps 10 or 11, with frail limbs and a pale face. Her name was Lily, and she had been suffering from a severe and mysterious illness that had brought her to the hospital months ago. Tonight, as he entered her room, he noticed something different in her eyes, a wariness, an alertness that wasn't there before. Her small hands gripped the edges of the hospital bed tightly, as though holding on to something unseen. "Good evening, Lily. How are we feeling today?" Dr. Williams asked, trying to sound reassuring, though a slight unease began to settle in his chest. Lily glanced up at him, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and urgency. "Doctor, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Williams leaned forward, intrigued. "What is it, Lily?" She swallowed hard, her lips trembling slightly. "It's the shadow. He comes to see me at night." Dr. Williams blinked, not understanding at first. "A shadow? What do you mean?" Lily pulled the blanket tighter around herself, glancing nervously toward the far corner of the room. "It's always in the corner. He's tall, but I can't see his face. He doesn't say much, just stands there. But sometimes he tells me things I don't understand." Dr. Williams frowned, trying to suppress a smile. "Lily, you've been through a lot, and I know you're frightened. But sometimes, when we're sick or in pain, our minds can play tricks on us. Maybe you're just dreaming." But Lily shook her head, her eyes wide with a fear that Dr. Williams couldn't dismiss. "No, doctor. It's real. I'm not making it up. He tells me that I have to be careful, that the hospital is wrong, that I'm not safe here." Her voice dropped to a hushed tone, as though afraid to be overheard. "He said that there's something in this hospital, something dark." Dr. Williams stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He had seen many things in his career as a doctor. People scared of the dark, hallucinations brought on by fever and disease. But there was something about the conviction in Lily's voice that unsettled him. And then, as if the air in the room had thickened with the weight of her words, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. "Did he tell you anything else?" Dr. Williams asked, his voice softer now, trying to keep his tone calm. Lily hesitated, her small hands twisting the edge of her blanket. "He told me that I'm not the first. He said that other people, other patients, have seen him too." Dr. Williams felt a chill spread across his skin. He had never heard anything like this before, at least not in this hospital. There had been rumors, of course, whispers among the staff about strange occurrences late at night. But they were just rumors. Nothing concrete, nothing real. "Other patients?" he repeated, trying to focus on the conversation at hand, even as his mind began to churn with a growing sense of unease. Lily nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes, he warned them too. He said that there was something evil in this hospital, something bad, and that we need to stay away from it." Dr. Williams took a deep breath and stood up, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, Lily, I'll check on this. I'll make sure you're safe." He tried to reassure her with a smile, but the unease still lingered in his chest as he left her room. The shadowy figure. A warning. Dr. Williams dismissed the thought at first. He had heard of children having nightmares, of patients imagining things. But the sense of foreboding that Lily had left behind stayed with him. The next night, Dr. Williams returned to check on Lily again. As he passed the nurse's station, he overheard a conversation between two nurses, their voices lowered as though discussing something forbidden. "It's happening again, just like before," one nurse whispered. "The new girl in room 212. She saw him too." Dr. Williams paused, his curiosity piqued. "Who saw who?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The nurses looked up, startled to see him standing there, and one of them quickly tried to change the subject. "Oh, just a patient, Dr. Williams. Nothing to worry about." But Dr. Williams wasn't convinced. "What patient? What are you talking about?" he pressed, his tone firmer now. The second nurse, a more experienced staff member, sighed, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "It's a shadow," she said in a hushed voice. "A shadow that visits the patients at night. They see him, they talk about him, and every time it's the same. He tells them things, warnings, about things that aren't right here. And then they get worse. Some of them get sicker. Some, they disappear." Dr. Williams frowned. "Disappear?" The nurse nodded grimly. "Yes, it's happened before. No one talks about it, but some patients have just vanished. No trace, no explanation. It's like they were taken." Dr. Williams felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just some fevered imagination. There was something happening here, something more than just a coincidence. Over the next few days, Dr. Williams quietly spoke to other patients, trying to find any other evidence of this strange, shadowy figure. To his surprise, several of them, both young and old, reported similar experiences. One elderly patient claimed she had seen the figure standing at the foot of her bed, his dark silhouette completely devoid of any distinguishing features. Another, a young man recovering from surgery, insisted that the figure had visited him in the night, speaking in whispers that chilled him to the bone. There were similarities to the stories, but no one knew who or what this shadow was. Dr. Williams couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to investigate. So, one night, after finishing his rounds, he decided to spend the night at the hospital. He would sit in the shadows, watch, and listen, perhaps catch a glimpse of the figure for himself. The clock ticked slowly, and the hours passed in a tense silence. He had settled into a small corner of the hospital, hidden from view but with a clear line of sight to the rooms where the patients had reported seeing the shadow. Time crawled by, but then, just as the night seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm, he saw it. A figure, tall, indistinct, and shrouded in darkness, emerged from the far end of the hallway. Dr. Williams's breath caught in his throat. He watched as the figure glided silently down the hall, stopping at the door of one of the rooms. The door creaked open, and the figure vanished inside. Dr. Williams's heart raced. He had to act. He approached the room, his footsteps soft but purposeful. Inside, the patient, Lily, was sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room where the shadow had appeared. Her eyes were wide with terror. Dr. Williams called out, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, save for Lily, who trembled in the bed. But as Dr. Williams approached, something cold and unnerving washed over him. And then it hit him. The figure wasn't there to harm the patients. It wasn't a threat. It was trying to protect them. The ghostly shadow was the spirit of Dr. Harlan, a former physician who had died in a freak accident decades ago, an accident that had been swept under the rug. Dr. Harlan had been investigating the same dark force that Dr. Williams had only just begun to uncover, a malevolent presence that had taken hold of the hospital, feeding off the suffering of its patients. And now, as the patients began to fall ill once again, Dr. Harlan's restless spirit had returned to warn them, to protect them from whatever it was that lurked in the dark corners of the hospital. Dr. Williams stood frozen, a sense of awe and dread flooding his veins as he realized that the shadowy figure was not an enemy. It was a protector. But how long could it protect them from the evil that had taken root in the hospital? And would anyone ever be able to stop it? The hospital's secrets were darker than Dr. Williams had imagined, and he had only just begun to uncover them. Story 5. Unexplained noises in the ER. The emergency room was always chaotic, but tonight it felt different. Dr. Williams could feel the tension in the air, thicker than usual. The beeping of machines, the murmurs of patients and nurses, and the frantic shuffle of staff trying to stabilize the incoming patients all blended together into an almost rhythmic cacophony. But tonight, there was something else, something that didn't belong. The first sound came around midnight, when the ER was quieter than usual. Dr. Williams had just finished his rounds and was sitting in the break room, sipping on a cup of lukewarm coffee. It was a rare quiet moment in the ER, one that was often interrupted by the sound of incoming ambulances or frantic calls for help. But tonight, the stillness stretched too long. A sudden, distant scream echoed through the walls, so loud and so visceral that Dr. Williams nearly dropped his cup. The sound wasn't like the usual cries of pain from the patients. This scream felt primal, full of terror and agony. It reverberated through the hallways, but when he glanced around the room, no one seemed to notice. His colleagues continued their work, as if the sound hadn't even happened. Confused but not yet alarmed, Dr. Williams returned to his paperwork. He tried to brush off the sensation of unease creeping down his spine. Hospitals were full of strange noises after all. The plumbing, the air ducts, the buildings settling in the night. But as the night wore on, the sounds only grew more frequent. Heavy footsteps began to echo down the hallways. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking with purpose. But when Dr. Williams went to investigate, there was no one there. The nurses at the station looked just as confused, shrugging it off with nervous laughter. But then, around 3 a.m., things took a darker turn. A muffled, guttural cry filled the room. It was so faint at first that Dr. Williams wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. Then, the air seemed to thicken, and the cry grew louder, more desperate, until it was unmistakable. It was a voice or several voices, all crying out in torment. This wasn't just an odd noise. It was a call for help. Dr. Williams stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. He knew the hospital well, every hallway, every wing, every door. And yet, these cries were coming from a place he didn't recognize, a part of the hospital that had been sealed off for years. "Are you hearing this?" Dr. Williams asked, his voice tight as he turned to the nurse beside him. She looked pale, her face stricken with fear. "It's coming from below," she said almost too quietly. "The basement." Dr. Williams frowned. The hospital basement was an old, forgotten part of the facility, and used, abandoned, and by all accounts, haunted. He'd heard stories about the strange occurrences in the basement, whispers from long ago about a time when the hospital housed an experimental psychiatric program. But no one ever spoke about it openly. It had been shut down after a series of unexplained deaths and disappearances, and the area had been sealed off ever since. "I'll go check it out," Dr. Williams said, his voice firm, though his stomach twisted with unease. The nurse hesitated. "You don't want to go down there, Dr. Williams." Not alone, but he was already heading toward the elevator before she could stop him. His mind raced as he descended into the lower levels of the hospital. The further down he went, the darker it became, and the more oppressive the air felt. He could hear the muffled cries growing louder with each passing moment, echoing off the cold concrete walls. The elevator doors opened to reveal a long, narrow hallway, dimly lit by flickering lights that seemed barely able to stay on. The stench of mold and decay was heavy in the air. Dr. Williams took a deep breath and stepped out, his footsteps echoing in the silence that enveloped him. He knew he had to get to the source of the sounds. Following the hallway, he reached an old, rusted door at the far end. The door was ajar, and a faint, unnatural light spilled out from the cracks. The cries were coming from inside. Dr. Williams hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. Something about this place felt wrong, as though it were alive with memories of pain and suffering. But the cries were too desperate to ignore. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. What he found took his breath away. The room was large, and the walls were covered in peeling paint, stained with what seemed to be blood or some other dark, viscous substance. Old, rusty medical equipment lay scattered around the floor. Shards of glass, broken syringes, and files with names and dates that were too faded to read. But what truly disturbed him was the presence of the patients. They were ghosts, souls that hadn't moved on. Some were lying on old, decrepit beds, their bodies contorted in ways that seemed physically impossible. Others were wandering the room, their faces twisted in eternal agony. They all looked at Dr. Williams with hollow eyes, as though pleading for release. The room itself seemed to hum with a strange energy, and as Dr. Williams stood frozen, his mind racing to comprehend what he was seeing, a figure stepped forward. The figure was tall, thin, and gaunt. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his skull, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. He wore the remnants of a hospital gown, and there was something distinctly wrong about the way he moved. As he drew closer, Dr. Williams felt a coldness wash over him. The figure opened his mouth, and the voice that came out was not his own, but a chorus of voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, speaking in unison. "You shouldn't be here," the voices said, their tone haunting and guttural. "We never left." Dr. Williams took a step back, his mind reeling. These were the patients from the abandoned psychiatric program, the ones who had been subjected to cruel, inhumane experiments decades ago. The ones whose deaths had been covered up, whose trauma had been ignored. But now, they were trapped in this place, their souls tormented by the horrors they had experienced. The figure's eyes locked onto Dr. Williams, and a sudden wave of nausea hit him. He understood now. The noise, the footsteps, the cries, it was all them. They were trying to communicate, to warn him. And now that he had come down here, he was part of their curse. The souls of the patients had become bound to the ER, forever reliving their trauma, and Dr. Williams had unwittingly triggered their wrath. The figure's mouth curled into a twisted smile, and the voices spoke once more. "You've awakened us," they whispered, their voices now rising in pitch, "and now you'll never escape." Dr. Williams stumbled backward, his mind flooded with panic. He turned and ran, the echoing footsteps of the ghost following him as he sprinted down the hallway, his breath ragged in his chest. But no matter how fast he ran, it felt like the distance between him and the exit was growing longer, as if the hospital itself were closing in around him. Finally, he reached the elevator, the doors sliding open just as he heard the screeching cries of the tortured souls behind him. He slammed the button to return to the upper floors, and the elevator shot upward, but the cries followed, the darkness pressing against the glass. When the doors finally opened to the ER, Dr. Williams staggered out, his heart racing, his body drenched in cold sweat. He couldn't explain what he had seen. He couldn't make sense of it. But one thing was clear. The spirits of the patients who had been wronged all those years ago were still here. And they were not going to let anyone forget the horrors they had endured. Dr. Williams knew that the hospital was no longer just a place of healing. It had become a prison for the lost souls of the past, their trauma lingering, never truly gone. And now, it was up to him to uncover the dark secrets that had been buried in the hospital's depths, and to figure out how to stop the torment before it consumed him, too. Dr. Williams stood alone in the center of the ER, his eyes scanning the sterile, familiar walls that now seemed more like a labyrinth of suffering than a place of healing. The once bustling hospital had become a haunting prison, a place where the spirits of the past still roamed, their voices echoing in the hallways, their pain and anger a constant undercurrent to the hospital's everyday operations. The weight of it all pressed down on him. But in his heart, Dr. Williams knew that there was no escaping the truth now. He had seen it, felt it, and lived it. The hospital, with all its history, was cursed, its foundations soaked in blood, its walls infused with secrets that refused to stay buried. The paranormal occurrences, the ghostly apparitions, the strange, otherworldly noises. It was all part of a greater, darker truth that Dr. Williams could no longer ignore. He had uncovered the remains of the hospital's long-forgotten, experimental psychiatric program, where patients had been subjected to unimaginable horrors, their suffering hidden behind the hospital's facade of healing. But that was not all. The true evil that haunted the hospital was not just the tortured souls of the patients. It was the malevolent force that had been feeding off the darkness for decades, manipulating the hospital's very nature. Dr. Williams could feel its presence now, like a shadow that hung over him, a constant, oppressive weight pressing against his chest. The force that controlled the hospital was more than just a collection of restless spirits. It was an entity, one born from the same corruption that had plagued the hospital in the past. It had fed off the trauma, the suffering, and the desperation of countless patients and staff, growing stronger with every passing year. And now, it had turned its attention to Dr. Williams himself. He had tried to ignore the signs, the whispers, the strange sensations that had crept into his daily life. But now, there was no denying it. The entity had marked him as its next victim. It was only a matter of time before it would consume him, just as it had consumed so many others before him. But Dr. Williams wasn't ready to give in, not without a fight. In the dead of night, when the ER was quiet and the world outside seemed far away, Dr. Williams stood before the darkened doorway to the abandoned basement. The door creaked open as he stepped into the cold, damp air. The hospital had a pulse now, and it beat in rhythm with his own heart, slow, deliberate, and full of malice. The air tasted bitter, and the shadows seemed to reach out for him, hungry and waiting. He was here to confront the evil that had festered in the bowels of the hospital for decades. Inside, the same haunting figure, the twisted, ghostly doctor, emerged from the shadows, his hollow eyes fixated on Dr. Williams. He had come to face this figure before, but now there was no fear, no hesitation in his heart. This time, he wasn't just running away. He wasn't here to question or to uncover the truth. He was here to end it all. The figure opened its mouth, but the words that came out were no longer those of the spirits of the hospital, no longer a chorus of suffering souls. This time, it spoke in one voice, cold, calculating, and full of disdain. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed, its voice like the scrape of nails against a chalkboard. "I am the hospital. I am its history. I am its sins." Dr. Williams didn't flinch. He knew now what needed to be done. He had to sever the connection between the hospital and the malevolent force that had been feeding off it for so long. He had to break the cycle, or the darkness would continue to claim more lives, more souls, until the hospital became a permanent prison for all those it had wronged. With a steady hand, Dr. Williams reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small vial of holy water, something he had retrieved from a local priest after his encounters with the supernatural had become too much to ignore. The moment he uncorked the vial, the air around him seemed to grow colder, the shadows retreating just slightly as the liquid sparkled faintly in the dim light. He raised the vial high and spoke the words he had memorized, words that were meant to sever the ties between this world and the next. The figure screeched, a sound that shook the very foundation of the building, but Dr. Williams stood firm. With a single decisive motion, he poured the holy water onto the ground, and in an instant, the hospital seemed to come alive with a terrible, blinding light. The force that had held the hospital in its grip was weakening, and with it, the malevolent entity itself. The figure lunged at Dr. Williams, but in that final moment, it dissolved into nothingness, its power broken. The darkness that had clung to the hospital for so long began to recede, but the price had been paid. Dr. Williams was not untouched by the encounter. He felt the weight of the spirits, their anger, their grief, still lingering in the air, their voices echoing softly in his mind. But he had done it. He had freed the hospital from the grip of evil. As dawn broke over the horizon, Dr. Williams stood in the quiet of the ER, looking out over the city that now felt so distant, so foreign. The hospital was no longer the same place it had been just hours before. The atmosphere had shifted, the air was lighter, and the sense of dread that had once permeated the halls seemed to have lifted. But Dr. Williams knew that it was not over, not completely. The spirits, though free from the entity's control, still lingered, their stories unfinished. Some of them would find peace, but many would remain trapped, forever haunted by the darkness they had lived through. The hospital was still a place of healing, but it was also a place of reckoning. A reminder that the past can never truly be buried. It will always rise to the surface, resurfacing in ways that no one expects. Dr. Williams had learned a painful truth in those long, dark hours beneath the hospital. The past, with all its injustices and horrors, cannot be ignored. It cannot be swept away or forgotten. It will find a way to return, to haunt the present, until the stories are told and justice is finally served. As he left the hospital for the last time, Dr. Williams couldn't help but wonder how many other places in the world were like this. Places where the sins of the past were still alive, where the dead could never rest, not until the truth was brought to light. And though the hospital was now free of its malevolent force, the weight of that knowledge lingered with him, a constant reminder that the dead, once wronged, will always find a way to make their voices heard.